Chapter 6 of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 6. The Hole in Heaven. That delicate ruby light, which is one of the rarest but one of the most exquisite of evening effects, warmed the land, sky, and seas as if the whole world were washed in wine, and dyed almost scarlet the strong red head of Patrick Dalroy, as he stood on a waste of furze and bracken, where he and his friends had halted. One of his friends was re-examining a short gun, rather like a double-barreled carbine. The other was eating thistles. Dalroy himself was idle and ruminant, with his hands in his pockets and his eye on the horizon. Landwards the hills, plains, and woods lay bathed in the rose-red light, but it changed somewhat to purple, to cloud, and something like storm, over the distant violet strip of sea. It was toward the sea that he was staring. Suddenly he woke up, and seemed almost to rub his eyes, or at any rate to rub his red eyebrow. "Why, we're on the road of Pebblewick," he said. "That's the damned little tin chapel by the beach." "I know," answered his friend and guide. "We've done the old hare trick, doubled, you know. 9 times out of 10 it's the best. Parson Whitelady used to do it when they were after him for dog-stealing. I've pretty much followed his trail. You can't do better than stick to the best examples. They tell you, in London, that Dick Turpin rode to York. Well, I know he didn't, for my old grandfather up at Cobble's End knew the Turpins intimately, threw one of them into the river on a Christmas day, but I think I can guess what he did do and how the tale got about. If Dick was wise, he went flying up the Old North Road, shouting 'York, York,' or what not, before people recognized him. Then, if he did the thing properly, he might, half an hour afterwards, walk down the Strand with a pipe in his mouth. They say old Boney said, 'Go where you aren't expected,' and I suppose, as a soldier, he was right. But for a gentleman dodging the police, like yourself, it isn't exactly the right way of putting it. I should say, 'Go where you ought to be expected,' and you'll generally find your fellow creatures don't do what they ought about expecting any more than about anything else." "Well, this bit between here and the sea," said the captain, in a brown study, "I know it so well that I rather wish I'd never seen it again. Do you know," he asked, suddenly pointing to a patch and pit of sand that showed white in the dusky heath 100 yards away, "do you know what makes that spot so famous in history?" "Yes," answered Mr. Pump. "That's where old Mother Grouch shot the Methodist." "You are in error," said the captain. "Such an incident as you describe would in no case call for special comment or regret. No, that spot is famous because a very badly brought-up girl once lost a ribbon off a plait of black hair, and somebody helped her find it." "Has the other person been well brought up?" asked Pump, with a faint smile. "No," said Dalroy, staring at the sea. "He has been brought down." Then, rousing himself again, he made a gesture toward a further part of the heath. "Do you know the remarkable history of that old wall, the one beyond the last gorge over there?" "No," replied the other, "unless you mean Dead Man's Circus, that happened further along." "I do not mean Dead Man's Circus," said the captain. "The remarkable history of that wall is that somebody's shadow once fell on it, and that shadow was more desirable than the substance of all other living things. It is this," he cried almost violently, resuming his flippant tone, "it is this circumstance, Hump, and not the trivial and everyday incident of a dead man going to a circus to which you have presumed to compare it. It is this historical event which Lord Ivywood is about to commemorate by rebuilding the wall with solid gold and Greek marbles stolen by the Turks from the grave of Socrates. enclosing a column of solid gold 400 feet high, and surmounted by a colossal equestrian statue of a bankrupt Irishman riding backwards on a donkey. He lifted one of his long legs over the animal, as if about to pose for the group, then swung back on both feet again, and again looked at the purple limit of the sea. "Do you know, Hump," he said, "I think modern people have somehow got their minds all wrong about human life. They seem to expect what nature has never promised, and then try to ruin all that nature has really given. At all those atheist chapels of Ivywood's, they're always talking of peace, perfect peace, and utter peace, and universal joy, and souls that beat as one. But they don't look any more cheerful than anyone else, and the next thing they do is to start smashing 1,000 good jokes, and good stories, and good songs, and good friendships by pulling down the old ship." He gave a glance at the loose signpost lying on the heath beside him, almost as if to reassure himself that it was not stolen. "Now, it seems to me," he went on, "that this is asking for too much and getting too little. I don't know whether God means a man to have happiness in that all-in-all and utterly utter sense of happiness, but God does mean a man to have a little fun, and I mean to go on having it. If I mustn't satisfy my heart, I can gratify my humor. The cynical fellows who think themselves so damned clever have a sort of saying, 'Be good and you will be happy, but you will not have a jolly time.' The cynical fellows are quite wrong, as they generally are. They have got hold of the exact opposite of the truth. God knows I don't set up to be good. But even a rascal sometimes has to fight the world in the same way as a saint. I think I have fought the world. Et militavi non sine. What's the Latin for having a lark? I can't pretend to peace and joy and all the rest of it, particularly in this original briar-patch. I haven't been happy, Hump, but I have had a jolly time." The sunset stillness settled down again, save for the cropping of the donkey in the undergrowth, and Pump said nothing sympathetically, and it was Dalroy once more who took up his parable. "So, I think there's too much of this playing on our emotions, Hump, as this place is certainly playing the cat and banjo with mine. Damn it all, there are other things to do with the rest of one's time. I don't like all this fuss about feeling things. It only makes people miserable. In my present frame of mind, I'm in favor of doing things, all of which, Hump," he said with a sudden lift of the voice that always went in him with a rushing, irrational return of merely animal spirits, "all of which I have put into a song against songs that I will now sing you." "I shouldn't sing it here," said Humphrey Pump, picking up his gun and putting it under his arm. "You look large in this open place, and you sound large, but I'll take you to the hole in heaven you've been talking about so much, and hide you as I used to hide you from that tutor. I couldn't catch his name. Man who could only get drunk on Greek wine at Squire Wimpole's." "Hump!" cried the captain. "I abdicate the throne of Ithaca. You are far wiser than Ulysses. Here I have had my heart torn with temptations to 10,000 things between suicide and abduction, and all by the mere sight of that hole in the heath where we used to have picnics. And all that time I'd forgotten we used to call it the hole in heaven. And by God, what a good name, in both senses." "I thought you'd have remembered it, Captain," said the innkeeper, "from the joke young Mr. Matthews made." "In the heat of some savage hand-to-hand struggle in Albania," said Mr. Dalroy sadly, pressing his palm across his brow, "I must have forgotten for one fatal instant the joke young Mr. Matthews made." "It wasn't very good," said Mr. Pump simply. "Ah, his aunt was the one for things like that. She went too far with old Gudgeon, though." With these words he jumped, and seemed to be swallowed up by the earth. But they had merely strolled the few yards needed to bring them to the edge of the sand-pit on the heath of which they had been speaking. And it is one of the truths concealed by heaven from Lord Ivywood, and revealed by heaven to Mr. Pump, that a hiding-place can be covered when you are close to it, and yet be open and visible from some spot of vantage far off. From the side by which they approached it, the sudden hollow of sand, a kind of collapsed chamber in the heath, seemed covered with a natural curve of fern and furze, and flashed out of sight like a fairy. "It's all right," he called out from under a floor or roof of leaves. "You'll remember it all when you get there. This is the place to sing your song, Captain. Lord bless me, Captain, I don't remember your singing that Irish song you made up at college, bellowing it like a bull of Bashan, all about hearts and sleeves or some such thing, and her ladyship and the tutor never heard a breath, because that bank of sand breaks everything. It's worth knowing all this, you know. It's a pity it's not part of a young gentleman's education. Now, you shall sing me the song in favor of having no feelings, or whatever you call it." Dalroy was staring about him at the cavern of his old picnics, so forgotten and so startlingly familiar. He seemed to have lost all thought of singing anything, and simply to be groping in the dark house of his own boyhood. There was a slight trickle from a natural spring in the sandstone just under the ferns, and he remembered they used to try to boil the water in a kettle. He remembered a quarrel about who had upset the kettle, which, in the morbidity of first love, had given him for days the tortures of the damned. When the energetic pump broke once more through the rather thorny roof, on an impulse to accumulate their other eccentric possessions, Patrick remembered about a thorn in a finger that made his heart stop with something that was pain and perfect music. When Pump returned with the rum keg and the cheese, and rolled them with a kick down the shelving sandy side of the hole, he remembered, with almost wrathful laughter, that in the old days he had rolled down that slope himself, and thought it rather a fine thing to do. He felt then as if he were rolling down a smooth side of the Matterhorn. He observed now that the height was rather less than that of the second story of one of the stunted cottages he had noted on his return. He suddenly understood he had grown bigger in a bodily sense. He had doubts about any other. "The Hole in Heaven," he said. "What a good name! What a good poet I was in those days! The Hole in Heaven. But does it let one in or let one out?" In the last level shafts of the fallen sun, the fantastic shadow of the long-eared quadruped, whom Pump had now tethered to a new and nearer pasture, fell across the last sunlit scrap of sand. Dalroy looked at the long exaggerated shadow of the ass, and laughed that short explosive laugh he had uttered when the doors of the harems had been closed after the Turkish war. He was normally a man much too loquacious, but he never explained those laughs. Humphrey Pump plunged down again into the sunken nest, and began to broach the cask of rum in his own secret style, saying, "We can get something else somehow tomorrow. For tonight we can eat cheese and drink rum, especially as there's a water on tap, so to speak. And now, Captain, sing us the song against songs." Patrick Dalroy drank a little rum out of a small medicine glass, which the generally unaccountable Mr. Pump unaccountably procured from his waistcoat pocket. But Patrick's colour had risen. His brow was almost as red as his hair, and he was evidently reluctant. "I don't see why I should sing all the songs," he said. "Why the divil don't you sing a song yourself? And now, come to think of it," he cried, with an accumulating brogue, not perhaps wholly unaffected by the rum, which he had not, in fact, drunk for years, "and now I come to think of it, what about that song of yours? All me youth's comin' back in this blessed and cursed place, and I remember that song of yours, that never existed nor ever will. Don't ye remember, Humphrey Pump, that night when I sang ye no less than 17 songs of me own composition?" "I remember it very well," answered the Englishman with restraint. "And don't ye remember," went on the exhilarated Irishman with solemnity, "that unless ye could produce a poetic lyric of your own, written and sung by yourself, I threaten to—" "To sing again," said the impenetrable Pump. "Yes, I know." He calmly proceeded to take out of his pockets, which were, alas, more like those of a poacher than an innkeeper, a folded and faded piece of paper. "I wrote it when you asked me," he said simply. "I have never tried to sing it. But I'll sing it myself, when you've sung your song against anybody singing at all." "All right!" cried the somewhat excited captain. "To hear a song from you? Why, I'll sing anything. This is the song against songs, Hump." And again he let his voice out like a bellow against the evening silence. "The song of the sorrow of Melisande is a weary song and a dreary song. The glory of Mariana's Grange had got into great decay. The song of the raven, Nevermore, has never been called a cheery song, and the brightest things in Baudelaire are anything else but gay. But who will write us a riding song, or a hunting song, or a drinking song, fit for them that arose and rode when day and the wine were red? But bring me a quart of claret out, and I will write you a clinking song, a song of war, and a song of wine, and a song to wake the dead. The song of the fury of Frogolet is a florid song and a torrid song. The song of the sorrow of Tara is sung to a harp unstrung. The song of the cheerful Shropshire Kid I consider a perfectly horrid song, and the song of the happy Futurist is a song that can't be sung. But who will write us a riding song, or a fighting song, or a drinking song, fit for the fathers of you and me, that knew how to think and thrive? But the song of beauty and art and love is simply an utterly stinking song, to double you up and drag you down and damn your soul alive. Take some more rum," concluded the Irish officer affably, "and let's hear your song at last." With the gravity inseparable from the deep conventionality of country people, Mr. Pump unfolded the paper on which he had recorded the only antagonistic emotion that was strong enough in him to screw his infinite English tolerance to the pitch of song. He read out the title very carefully and in full. "Song Against Grocers, by Humphrey Pump, sole proprietor of the old ship Pebblewick. Good accommodation for man and beast, celebrated as the house at which both Queen Charlotte and Jonathan Wild put up on different occasions, and where the ice-cream man is mistaken for Bonaparte. This song is written against grocers. God made the wicked grocer for a mystery and a sign, that men might shun the awful shops, and go to inns and dine. Where the bacon's on the rafter, and the wine is in the wood, and God has made good laughter, has seen that they are good. The evil-hearted grocer would call his mother ma'am, and bow at her, and bob at her, her aged soul to damn, and rub his horrid hands, and ask what article it was next, though mortis in articulo should be her proper text. His props are not his children, but pert lads underpaid, who call out cash, and bang about, to work his wicked trade. He keeps a lady in a cage most cruelly all day, and makes her count and calls her miss until she fades away. The righteous minds of innkeepers induce them now and then to crack a bottle with a friend or treat unmoneyed men. But who hath seen the grocer treat housemaids to his teas, or crack a bottle of fish sauce, or stand a man to cheese? He sells us sands of Araby as sugar for cash down. He sweeps his shop and sells the dust, the purest salt in town. He crams the cans of poisoned meat, poor subjects of the king, and when they die by thousands, why, he laughs like anything. The wicked grocer grosses in spirits and in wine, not frankly and in fellowship, as men in inns do dine, but packed with soap and sardines, and carried off by grooms, for to be snatched by duchesses, and drunk in dressing-rooms. The hell-instructed grocer has a temple made of tin, and the ruin of good innkeepers is loudly urged therein. But now the sands are running short from sugar of a sort. The grocer trembles for his time, just like his weight is short. Captain Dalroy was getting considerably heated with his nautical liquor, and his appreciation of Pump's song was not merely noisy but active. He leapt to his feet and waved his glass. "Ye ought to be poet laureate, Hump! Ye're right, ye're right! We'll stand all this no longer!" He dashed wildly up the sand slope and pointed with the sign-post towards the darkening shore, where the low shed of corrugated iron stood almost isolated. "There's your tin temple," he said. "Let's burn it!" They were some way along the coast from the large watering-place of Pebblewick, and between the gathering twilight and the rolling country it could not be clearly seen. Nothing was now in sight but the corrugated iron hall by the beach, and 3 half-built, red-brick villas. Dalroy appeared to regard the hall and the empty houses with great malevolence. "Look at it," said he. "Babylon!" He brandished the inn sign in the air like a banner, and began to stride towards the place, showering curses. "In 40 days," he called, "shall Pebblewick be destroyed. Dogs shall lap the blood of J. Levison, secretary, and unicorns—" "Come back, Pat," cried Humphrey. "You've had too much rum." "Lions shall howl in its high places," vociferated the captain. "Donkeys will howl anyhow," said Pump, "but I suppose the other donkey must follow." And loading and untethering the quadruped, he began to lead him along. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 7 The Society of Simple Souls. Under sunset, at once softer and more sombre, under which the leaden sea took on a Lenten purple, a tint appropriate to tragedy, Lady Joan Brett was once more drifting moodily along the sea front. The evening had been rainy and lowering. The watering place season was nearly over, and she was almost alone on the shore. But she had fallen into the habit of restlessly pacing the place, and it seemed to satisfy some subconscious hunger in her rather mixed psychology. Through all her brooding, her animal senses always remained abnormally active. She could smell the sea when it had ebbed almost to the horizon, and in the same way she heard, through every whisper of waves or wind, the swish or flutter of another woman's skirt behind her. There is, she felt, something unmistakable about the movements of a lady who is generally very dignified, and rather slow, and who happens to be in a hurry. She turned to look at the lady who was thus hastening to overtake her, lifted her eyebrows a little, and held out her hand. The interruption was known to her as Lady Enid Wimpole, cousin of Lord Ivywood, a tall and graceful lady who unbalanced her own elegance by a fashionable costume that was at once funereal and fantastic. Her fair hair was pale but plentiful. Her face was not only handsome and fastidious in the aquiline style, but when considered seriously, was sensitive, modest, and even pathetic. But her wan blue eyes seemed slightly prominent, with that expression of cold eagerness that is seen in the eyes of ladies who ask questions at public meetings. Joan Brett was herself, as she had said, a connection of the Ivywood family. But Lady Enid was Ivywood's first cousin, and for all practical purposes his sister. For she kept house for him and his mother, who was now so incredibly old that she only survived to satisfy conventional opinion in the character of a speechless and useless chaperone. And Ivywood was not the sort who would be likely to call out any activity in an old lady exercising that office. Nor, for that matter, was Lady Enid Wimpole. There seemed to shine on her the face of some kind of inhuman, absent-minded common sense that shone on her cousins. "Oh, I'm so glad I've caught you up," she said to Joan. "Lady Ivywood wants you so much to come to us for the week end or so, while Philip is still there. He always admired your sonnet on Cyprus so much, and he wants to talk to you about this policy of his in Turkey. Of course he's awfully busy, but I shall be seeing him tonight, after the meeting." "No living creature," said Lady Joan, with a smile, "ever saw him except before or after a meeting." "Are you a simple soul?" asked Lady Enid, carelessly. "Am I a simple soul?" asked Joan, drawing her black brows together. "Merciful heavens, no! What can you mean?" "Their meeting's on tonight at the small universal hall, and Philip's taking the chair," explained the other lady. "He's very annoyed that he has to leave early to get up to the House. But Mr. Leveson can take the chair for the last bit. They've got Misysra Ammon." "Got Mrs. who?" asked Joan, in honest doubt. "You make a game of everything," said Lady Enid, in cheerless amiability. "It's the man everyone's talking about. You know as well as I do. It's really his influence that has made the simple souls." "Oh!" said Lady Joan Brett. Then, after a long silence, she added, "Who are the simple souls? I should be interested in them, if I could meet any." And she turned her dark brooding face on the darkening purple sea. "Do you mean to say, my dear," asked Lady Enid Wimpole, "that you haven't met any of them yet?" "No," said Joan, looking at the last dark line of sea. "I never met but one simple soul in my life." "But you must come to the meeting," cried Lady Enid, with frosty and sparkling gaiety. "You must come at once. Philip is certain to be eloquent on a subject like this, and of course Misysra Ammon is always so wonderful." Without any very distinct idea of where she was going or why she was going there, Joan allowed herself to be piloted to a low lead or tin shed, beyond the last straggling hotels, out of the echoing shell of which she could prematurely hear a voice that she thought she recognized. When she came in, Lord Ivywood was on his feet, in exquisite evening dress, but with a light overcoat thrown over the seat behind him. Beside him, in less tasteful but more obvious evening dress, was the little old man she had heard on the beach. No one else was on the platform, but just under it, rather to Joan's surprise, sat Miss Browning, her old typewriting friend, in her old black dress, industriously taking down Lord Ivywood's words in shorthand. A yard or two off, even more to her surprise, sat Miss Browning's more domestic sister, also taking down the same words in shorthand. "That is Misysra Ammon," whispered Lady Enid, earnestly, pointing a delicate finger at the little old man beside the chairman. "I know him," said Joan. "Where's the umbrella?" "At least evident," Lord Ivywood was saying, "that one of those ancestral impossibilities is no longer impossible. The East and the West are one. The East is no longer East, nor the West West, for a small isthmus has been broken, and the Atlantic and Pacific are a single sea. No man assuredly has done more of this mighty work of unity than the brilliant and distinguished philosopher to whom you will have the pleasure of listening tonight. And I profoundly wish that affairs more practical, for I will not call them more important, did not prevent my remaining to enjoy his eloquence, as I have so often enjoyed it before. Mr. Leveson has kindly consented to take my place, and I can do no more than express my deep sympathy with the aims and ideals which will be developed before you tonight. I have long been increasingly convinced that underneath a certain mask of stiffness which the Mohammedan religion has worn through certain centuries, as a somewhat similar mask has been worn by the religion of the Jews, Islam has in it the potentialities of being the most progressive of all religions, so that a century or two to come we may see the cause of peace, of science, and of reform everywhere supported by Islam, as it is everywhere supported by Israel. Not in vain, I think, is the symbol of that faith the crescent, the growing thing. While other creeds carry emblems implying more or less of finality, for this great creed of hope, its very imperfection is its pride, and men shall walk fearlessly in new and wonderful paths, following the increasing curve which contains and holds up before them the eternal promises of the orb. It was characteristic of Lord Ivywood that, though he was really in a hurry, he sat down slowly and gravely amid the outburst of applause. The quiet resumption of the speaker's seat, like the applause itself, was an artistic part of the peroration. When the last clap or stamp had subsided, he sprang up alertly. his light greatcoat over his arm, shook hands with the lecturer, bowed to the audience, and slid quickly out of the hall. Mr. Leveson, the swarthy young man with the drooping double eyeglass, rather bashfully to the front, took the empty seat on the platform, and in a few words presented the eminent Turkish mystic, Misysra Ammon, sometimes called the Prophet of the Moon. Lady Joan found the Prophet's English accent somewhat improved by good society, but he still elongated the letter U in the same bleating manner, and his remarks had exactly the same rabidly wrong-headed ingenuity as his lecture upon English inns. It appeared that he was speaking on the higher polygamy, but he began with a sort of general defense of the Moslem civilization, especially against the charge of sterility and worldly ineffectiveness. "It is just in the practical things," he was saying, "it is just in the practical things, if you could come to consider them in a manner quite equal, that our methods are better than your methods. My ancestors invented the curved swords because one cuts better with a curved sword. Your ancestors possessed the straight swords out of some romantic fancy of being what you call straight. Or I will take a more plain example of which I have myself experience. When I first had the honour of meeting Lord Ivywood, I was unused to your various ceremonies, and had a little difficulty, just a little difficulty, in entering Mr. Claridge's hotel, where his lordship had invited me. A servant of the hotel was standing just beside me on the doorstep. I stooped down to take off my boots, and he asked me what I was doing. I said to him, 'My friend, I am taking off my boots.'" A smothered sound came from Lady Joan Brett, but the lecturer did not notice it, and went on with a beautiful simplicity. "I told him that in my country, when showing respect for any spot, we do not take off our hats, we take off our boots. And because I would keep on my hat and take off my boots, he suggested to me that I had been afflicted by Allah in the head. Now was not that funny?" "Very," said Lady Joan inside her handkerchief, for she was choking with laughter. Something like a faint smile passed over the earnest faces of the 2 or 3 most intelligent of the simple souls, but for most part the souls seemed very simple indeed, helpless looking people with limp hair and gowns like green curtains, and their dry faces were as dry as ever. "But I explained to him for a long time, for a carefully occupied time, that it was more practical, more businesslike, more altogether for utility, to take off the boots than to remove the hat. 'Let us,' I said to him, 'consider what many complaints are made against the footwear, what few complaints against the headwear. You complain if in your drawing rooms is the marching about of muddy boots. Are any of your drawing rooms marked thus with the marching about of muddy hats? How very many of your husbands kick you with the boot, yet how few of your husbands on any occasion butt you with the hat.'" He looked round with a radiant seriousness, which made Lady Joan almost as speechless for sympathy as she was for amusement. With all that was most sound in his too complicated soul, she realized the presence of a man really convinced. "The man on the doorstep, he would not listen to me," went on Misysra Ammon pathetically. "He said there would be a crowd if I stood on the doorstep holding in my hand my boots. Well, I do not know why in your country you always send the young males to be the first of your crowds. They certainly were making a number of noises, the young males." Lady Joan Brett stood up suddenly and displayed enormous interest in the rest of the audience in the back parts of the hall. She felt that if she looked for one moment more at the serious face with the Jewish nose and the Persian beard, she would publicly disgrace herself, or, what was quite as bad, for she was the generous sort of aristocrat, publicly insult the lecturer. She had a feeling that the sight of all the simple souls in bulk might have a soothing effect. It had. It had what might have been mistaken for a depressing effect. Lady Joan resumed her seat with a controlled countenance. "Now why," asked the Eastern philosopher, "do I tell so simple a little story of your London streets? A thing happening any day. The little mistake had no prejudicial effect. Lord Ivywood came out at the end. He made no attempt to explain the true view of so important matters to Mr. Claridge's servant, though Mr. Claridge's servant remained on the doorstep. But he commanded Mr. Claridge's servant to restore to me one of my boots, which had fallen down the front steps while I was explaining this harmlessness of the hat in the home. So all was, for me, very well. But why do I tell such little tales?" He spread out his hands again in his fan-like Eastern style. Then he clapped them together so suddenly that Joan jumped and looked instinctively for the entrance of 500 negro slaves laden with jewels. But it was only his emphatic gesture of eloquence. He went on with an excited thickening of the accent. "Because, my friends, this is the best example I could give of the wrong and slanderous character of the charge that we fail in our domesticities, that we fail especially in our treatment of the womankind. I appeal to any lady, to any Christian lady. Is not the boot more devastating, more dreaded in the home than the hat? The boot jumps. He bound, he run about, he break things, he leave on the carpet the earths of the garden. The hat, he remain quiet on his hat peg. Look at him on his hat peg. How quiet and good he remain. Why not let him remain quiet also on his head?" Lady Joan applauded warmly, as did several other ladies, and the sage went on, encouraged. "Can you not therefore trust, dear ladies, this great religion to understand you concerning other things, as it understands you regarding boots? What is the common objection our worthy enemies make against our polygamy? That it is disdainful of womanhood. But how can this be so, my friends, when it allows the womanhood to be present in so large numbers? When in your House of Commons you put 100 English members and just one little Welsh member, you do not say, 'The Welshman is on top. He is our Sultan. May he live for ever.' If your jury contained 11 great large ladies and one little man, you would not say, 'This is unfair to the great large ladies.' Why should you shrink then, ladies, from this great polygamical experiment which Lord Ivywood himself—" Joan's dark eyes were still fixed on the wrinkled, patient face of the lecturer, but every word of the rest of the lecture was lost to her. Under her glowing Spanish tint she had turned pale with extraordinary emotions, but she did not stir a hair. The door of the hall stood open, and occasional sounds came even from that deserted end of the town. Two men seemed to be passing along the distant parade. One of them was singing. It was common enough for workmen to sing going home at night, and the voice, though a loud one, would have been too far off for Joan to hear the words. Only Joan happened to know the words. She could almost see them before her, written in a round, swaggering hand on a pink page of an old schoolgirl album at home. She knew the words and the voice. "I come from Castlepatrick and my heart is on my sleeve, and any sword or pistol boy can hit it with my leave. It shines therefore an epaulet as golden as a flame, as naked as me ancestors, as noble as me name. For I come from Castlepatrick and my heart is on my sleeve, but a lady stole it from me on St. Galloglass's Eve." Startlingly, and with strong pain, there sprang up before Joan's eyes a patch of broken heath with a very deep hollow of white sand, blinding in the sun. No words, no name, only the place. "The folks that live in Liverpool, their heart is in their boots. They go to hell like lambs, they do, because their hooter hoots. Where men may not be dancing, though the wheels may dance all day, and men may not be smoking, but only chimneys may. But I come from Castlepatrick and my heart is on my sleeve, but a lady stole it from me on St. Polyander's Eve. The folks that live in Black Belfast, their heart is in their mouth. They see us making murders in the meadows of the South. They think a plow's a wreck, they do, and cattle calls our creeds. And they think we're burning witches when we're only burning weeds. But I come from Castlepatrick and me heart is on me sleeve. But a lady stole it from me on St. Barnabas' Eve. The voice had stopped suddenly, but the last lines were so much more distinct that it was certain the singer had come nearer, and was not marching away. It was only after all this, and through a sort of cloud, that Lady Joan heard the indomitable Oriental bringing his whole eloquent address to a conclusion. "And if you do not refuse the sun that returns and rises in the east with every morning, you will not refuse either this great social experiment, this great polygamical method, which also arose out of the east and always returns, for this is that higher polygamy which always comes, like the sun itself, out of the Orient, but is only at its noontide splendor when the sun is high in heaven." But she was vaguely conscious of Mr. Levison, the man with the dark face and the eyeglasses, acknowledging the entrancing lecture in suitable terms, and calling on any of the simple souls who might have questions to ask them. It was only when the simple souls had displayed their simplicity with the usual parade of well bred reluctance and fussy self effacement that anyone addressed the chair, and it was only after somebody had been addressing the chair for some time that Joan gradually awoke to the fact that the address was somewhat unusual. Chapter 7. The Society of Simple Souls.
8. Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola K. The Flying Inn by G. K. Chesterton. Chapter 8. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. "I am sure, Mr. Levison," the secretary had said, with a somewhat constrained smile, "that after the eloquent and epoch-making speech to which we have listened there will be some questions asked, and we hope to have a debate afterwards. I am sure somebody will ask a question." Then he looked interrogatively at one weary-looking gentleman in the fourth row and said, "Mr. Hinch?" Mr. Hinch shook his head with a pallid passion of refusal, wonderful to watch, and said, "I couldn't. I really couldn't." "We should be very pleased," said Mr. Levison, "if any lady would ask a question." In the silence that followed, it was somewhat psychologically borne in on the whole audience that one particular great large lady, as the lecturer would say, sitting at the end of the second row was expected to ask a question. Her own waxwork immobility was witness both to the expectation and its disappointment. "Are there any other questions?" asked Mr. Levison, as if there had been any yet. He seemed to speak with a slight air of relief. There was a sort of stir at the back of the hall, and halfway down one side of it. Choked whispers could be heard of, "Now then, George! Go it, George! Is there any questions? Gar!" Mr. Levison looked up with an alertness somewhat akin to alarm. He realized for the first time that a few quite common men in coarse, unclean clothes had somehow strolled in through the open door. They were not true rustics, but the semi-rustic labourers that linger about the limits of the large watering places. There was no "Mr." among them. There was a general tendency to call everybody George. Mr. Levison saw the situation and yielded to it. He modelled himself on Lord Ivywood, and did much what he would have done in all cases, but with a timidity Lord Ivywood would not have shown. And the same social training that made him ashamed to be with such men made him ashamed to own his shame. The same modern spirit that taught him to loathe such rags also taught him to lie about his loathing. "I am sure we should be very glad," he said nervously, "if any friends from outside care to join in our inquiry. Of course we're all Democrats," and he looked round at the grand ladies with a ghastly smile, "and believe in the voice of the people, and so on. If our friend at the back of the hall will put his question briefly, we need not insist, I think, on his putting it in writing?" There were renewed hoarse encouragements to George, that rightly christened champion, and he wavered forward on legs tied in the middle with string. He did not appear to have had any seat since his arrival, and made his remarks standing halfway down what we may call the central aisle. "Well, I want to ask the proprietor," he began. "Questions," said Mr. Leveson, swiftly seizing a chance for that construction of debate which is the main business of a modern chairman, "must be asked of the chair, if they are points of order. If they concern the address, they should be asked of the lecturer." "Well, I ask the lecturer," said the patient George, "whether it ain't right that when you 'ave the thing outside you should 'ave the thing inside." Hoarse applause at the back. Mr. Leveson was evidently puzzled and already suspicious that something was quite wrong. But the enthusiasm of the Prophet of the Moon sprang up instantly at any sort of question and swept the chairman along with it. "But it is the essence of our whole message," he cried, spreading out his arms to embrace the world, "that the outer manifestation should be one with the inner manifestation. My friends, it is this very truth our friend has stated that is responsible for our apparent lack of symbolism in Islam. We appear to neglect the symbol because we insist on the satisfactory symbol. My friend in the middle will walk round all our mosques and say loudly, 'Where is the statue of Allah?' But can my friend in the middle really execute a complete and generally approved statue of Allah?" Misysra Ammon sat down greatly satisfied with his answer. But it was doubted by many whether he had conveyed the satisfaction to his friend in the middle. That seeker after truth wiped his mouth with the back of his hand with an unsatisfied air and said, "No offense, sir, but ain't it the law, sir, that if you 'ave that outside we're all right? I came in 'ere as natural as could be, but Gorlum, I never see a place like this afore." Hoarse laughter behind. "No apology is needed, my friend," cried the Eastern sage eagerly. "I can conceive you are not perhaps duly conversant with such schools of truth. But the law is all. The law is Allah, the inmost unity of—" "Well, ain't it the law?" repeated the dogged George, and every time he mentioned the law, the poor men who are its chief victims applauded loudly. "I'm not one to make a fuss. I never was one to make a fuss. I'm a law-abidin' man, I am." More applause. "Ain't it the law that if so be such is your sign and such is your profession, you ought to serve us?" "I fear I not quite follow," cried the eager Turk. "I ought?" "To serve us," shouted a throng of thick voices from the back of the hall, which was already much more crowded than before. "Serve you!" cried Misysra, leaping up like a spring released. "The Holy Prophet came from heaven to serve you. The virtue and valor of 1,000 years, my friend, has had no hunger but to serve you. We are of all faiths the most the faith of service. Our highest prophet is no more than the servant of God, as I am, as you all are. Even for our symbol we choose a satellite, and honor the moon because it only serves the earth and does not pretend to be the sun." "I'm sure," cried Mr. Leveson, jumping up with a tactful grin, "that the lecturer has answered this last point in a most eloquent and effective way, and the motor cars are waiting for some of the ladies who have come from some distance, and I really think the proceedings—" All the artistic ladies were already getting on their wraps, with faces varying from bewilderment to blank terror. Only Lady Joan lingered, trembling with unexplained excitement. The hitherto speechless Hinch had slid up to the chairman's seat and whispered to him, "You must get all the ladies away. I can't imagine what's up, but something's up." "Well," repeated the patient George, "so be it's the law. Where is it?" "Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Leveson in his most ingratiating manner, "I think we have had a most delightful evening and—" "No, we ain't!" cried a new and nastier voice from a corner of the room. "Where is it?" "That's what we got a right to know," said the law-abiding George. "Where is it?" "Where's what?" cried the nearly demented secretary in the chair. "What do you want?" The law-abiding Mr. George made a half turn and a gesture towards the man in the corner and said, "What's yours, Jim?" "I'll have a drop of Scotch," said the man in the corner. Lady Enid Wimpole, who had lingered a little in loyalty to Joan, the only other lady still left, caught both her wrists and cried in a thrilling whisper, "Oh, we must go to the car, dear. They're using the most awful language." Away on the wettest edge of the sands by the sea the prints of 2 wheels and 4 hoofs were being slowly washed away by a slowly rising tide, which was indeed the only motive of the man Humphrey Pump leading the donkey cart in leading it almost ankle deep in water. "I hope you're sober again now," he said with some seriousness to his companion, a huge man, walking heavily and even humbly with the straight sword swinging to and fro at his hip, for honestly it was a mug's game to go and stick up the old sign before that tin place. "I haven't often spoken to you like this, Captain, but I don't believe any other man in the county could get you out of the hole as I can. But to go down there and frighten the ladies, why there's been nothing so silly here since Bishop's Folly. You could hear the ladies screaming before we left." "I heard worse than that long before we left," said the large man without lifting his head. "I heard one of them laugh. Christ, do you think I shouldn't hear her laugh?" There was a silence. "I didn't mean to speak sharp," said Humphrey Pump, with that incorruptible kindliness which was the root of his Englishry and may yet save the soul of the English, "but it's the truth. I was pretty well bothered about how to get out of this business. You're braver than I am, you see, and I own I was frightened about both of us. If I hadn't known my way to the lost tunnel, I should be fairly frightened still." "Known your way to what?" asked the Captain, lifting his red head for the first time. "Oh, you know all about No More Ivywood's lost tunnel," said Pump carelessly. "Why, we all used to look for it when we were boys. Only I happened to find it." "Have mercy on an exile," said Dalroy humbly. "I don't know which hurt him most, the things he forgets or the things he remembers." Mr. Pump was silent for a little while and then said, more seriously than usual, "Well, the people from London say you must put up placards and statues and subscriptions and epitaphs and the Lord knows what to the people who found some new trick and made it come off. But only a man that knows his own land for 40 miles round knows what a lot of people, and clever people too, there were who found new tricks and had to hide them because they didn't come off. There was Dr. Boone up by Gill and Hugby who held out against Dr. Collison and the vaccination. His treatment saved 60 patients who had got smallpox, and Dr. Collison's killed 92 patients who hadn't got anything. But Boone had to keep it dark, naturally, because all his lady patients grew mustaches. It was a result of the treatment, but it wasn't a result he wishes to dwell on. Then there was old Dean Arthur who discovered balloons if ever a man did. He discovered them long before they were discovered, but people were suspicious about such things just then. There was a revival of the witch business in spite of all the parsons, and he had to sign a paper saying where he'd got the notion. Well, it stands to reason you wouldn't like to sign a paper saying you'd got it from the village idiot when you were both blowing soap bubbles. And that's all he could have signed, for he was an honest gentleman, the poor old Dean. Then there was Jack Arlingham and the diving bell, but you remember all about that. Well, it was just the same with the man that made this tunnel, one of the mad Ivywoods. There's many a man, Captain, that has a statue in the great London squares for helping to make the railway trains. There's many a man has his name in Westminster Abbey for doing something in discovering steamboats. Poor old Ivywood discovered both at once, and had to be put under control. He had a notion that a railway train might be made to rush right into the sea and turn into a steamboat, and it seemed all right according as he worked it out. But his family were so ashamed of the thing that they didn't like the tunnel even mentioned. I don't think anybody knows where it is but me and Bunchy Robinson. We shall be there in a minute or two. They've thrown the rocks about at this end and let the thick plantation grow at the other, but I've got a racehorse through before now, to save it from Colonel Chepstow's little games, and I think I can manage this donkey. Honestly, I think it's the only place we'll be safe in after what we've left behind us at the Pebblewick. But it's the best place in the world, there's no doubt, for lying low and starting afresh. Here we are. You think you can't get behind that rock, but you can. In fact, you have. Dalroy found himself with some bewilderment round the corner of a rock and in a long bore or barrel of blackness that ended in a very dim spot of green. Hearing the hoofs of the ass and the feet of his friend behind him, he turned his head, but could see nothing but the pitch darkness of a closed coal cellar. He turned again to the dim green speck, and marching forward was glad to see it grow larger and brighter like a big emerald, till he came out on a throng of trees, mostly thin, but growing so thickly and so close to the cavernous entrance of the tunnel that it was quite clear the place was meant to be choked up by forests and forgotten. The light that came glimmering through the trees was so broken and tremulous that it was hard to tell whether it was daybreak or moonrise. "I know there's water here," said Pump. "They couldn't keep it out of the stonework when they made the tunnel, and old Ivywood hit the hydraulic engineer with a spirit level. With the bit of covert here and the sea behind us, we ought to be able to get food of one kind or another when the cheese has given out, and donkeys can eat anything. By the way," he added with some embarrassment, "you don't mind my saying it, Captain, but I think we'd better keep that rum for rare occasions. It's the best rum in England, and may be the last if these mad games are going on. It'll do us good to feel it's there so we can have it when we want it. The cask's still nearly full." Dalroy put out his hand and shook the other's. "Hump," he said seriously, "you're right. It's a sacred trust for humanity, and we'll only drink it ourselves to celebrate great victories. In token of which I will take a glass now to celebrate our glorious victory over Leveson and his tin tabernacle." He drained one glass and then sat down on the cask as if to put temptation behind him. His blue ruminant bull's eye seemed to plunge deeper and deeper into the emerald twilight of the trees in front of him, and it was long before he spoke again. At last he observed, "I think you said, Hump, that a friend of yours, a gentleman named Bunchy Robinson, I think, was also a habitué here?" "Yes, he knew the way," answered Pump, leading the donkey to the most suitable patch of pasturage. "May we, do you think, have the pleasure of a visit from Mr. Robinson?" inquired the captain. "Not unless they're jolly careless up in Blackstone Jail," replied Pump. And he moved the cheese well into the arch of the tunnel. Dalroy still sat with his square chin on his hand, staring at the mystery of the little wood. "You seem absent-minded, Captain," remarked Humphrey. "The deepest thoughts are all commonplaces," said Dalroy. "That is why I believe in democracy, which is more than you do, you foul, blood-stained old British Tory. And the deepest commonplace of all is that vanitas vanitatem, which is not pessimism, but is really the opposite of pessimism. It is man's futility that makes us feel he must be a god. And I think of this tunnel and how the poor old lunatic walked about on this grass, watching it being built, the soul in him on fire with the future. And he saw the whole world changed and the seas thronged with his new shipping. And now," and Dalroy's voice changed and broke, "now there is good pasture for the donkey, and it is very quiet here." "Yes," said Pump, in some way that conveyed his knowledge that the captain was thinking of other things also. The captain went on dreamily. "And I think about another Lord Ivywood recorded in history who also had a great vision. For it is a great vision after all, and though the man is a prig, he is brave. He also wants to drive a tunnel between East and West, to make the Indian Empire more British, to effect what he calls the orientation of England, and I call the ruin of Christendom. And I am wondering just now whether the clear intellect and courageous will of a madman will be strong enough to burst and drive that tunnel, as everything seems to show at this moment that it will, or whether there indeed be enough life and growth in your England to leave it at last as this is left, buried in English forests and wasted by an English sea." The silence fell between them again, and again there was only the slight sound the animal made in eating. As Dalroy had said, it was very quiet there. But it was not quiet in Pebblewick that night. When the Riot Act was read and all the people who had seen the signboard outside fought all the people who hadn't seen the signboard outside, or when babies and scientists next morning, seeking for shells and other common objects of the seashore, found that their study included fragments of the outer clothing of Leveson and scraps of corrugated iron. End of chapter 8. Recording by Nicola K. Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola K. The Flying Inn by G. K. Chesterton. Chapter 9. The Higher Criticism and Mr. Hips. Pebblewick boasted an enterprising evening paper of its own, called the Pebblewick Globe, and it was the great vaunt of the editor's life that he had got out an edition announcing the mystery of the vanishing signboard, almost simultaneously with its vanishing. In the rows that followed, sandwich men found no little protection from the blows indiscriminately given them behind and before, in the large wooden boards they carried, inscribed, "The Vanishing Pub, Pebblewick's Fairy Tale Special." And the paper contained a categorical and mainly correct account of what had happened, or what seemed to have happened, to the eyes of the amazed George and his crowd of sympathizers. George Byrne, carpenter of this town, with Samuel Gripes, drayman in the service of Messrs. J. and Gubbins, brewers, together with a number of other well-known residents, passed by the new building erected on the West Beach for various forms of entertainment and popularly called the Small Universal Hall. Seeing outside it one of the old inn signs now so rare, they drew the quite proper inference that the place retained the license to sell alcoholic liquors, which so many other places in this neighborhood have recently lost. The persons inside, however, appear to have denied all knowledge of the fact, and when the party, after some regrettable scenes in which no life was lost, came out on the beach again, it was found that the inn sign had been destroyed or stolen. All parties were quite sober, and had indeed obtained no opportunity to be anything else. The mystery is underlying inquiry. But this comparatively realistic record was local and spontaneous, and owed not a little to the accidental honesty of the editor. Moreover, evening papers are often more honest than morning papers, because they are written by ill-paid and hard-worked underlings in a great hurry, and there is no time for more timid people to correct them. By the time the morning papers came out next day, a faint but perceptible change had passed over the story of the vanishing signboard. In the daily paper, which had the largest circulation and the most influence in that part of the world, the problem was committed to a gentleman known by what seemed to the non-journalistic world the singular name of Hibbs However. It had been affixed to him in jest in connection with the almost complicated caution with which all his public criticisms were qualified at every turn, so that everything came to depend upon the conjunctions, upon but, and yet, and though, and similar words. As his salary grew larger, for editors and proprietors like that sort of thing, and his old friends fewer, for the most generous of friends cannot but feel faintly acid at a success which has in it nothing of the infectious flavour of glory, he grew more and more to value himself as a diplomatist, a man who always said the right thing. But he was not without his intellectual nemesis, for at last he became so very diplomatic as to be darkly and densely unintelligible. People who knew him had no difficulty in believing that what he had said was the right thing, the tactful thing, the thing that should save the situation. But they had great difficulty in discovering what it was. In his early days he had had a great talent for one of the worst tricks of modern journalism, the trick of dismissing the important part of a question, and appearing to get to business on the unimportant part of it. Thus he would say, "Whatever we may think of the rights and wrongs of the vivisection of pauper children, we shall all agree that it should only be done in any event by fully qualified practitioners." But in the later and darker days of his diplomacy he seemed rather to dismiss the important part of a subject and get to grips with some totally different subject, following some timid and elusive train of associations of his own. In his late bad manner, as they say of painters, he was just as likely to say, "Whatever we may think of the rights and wrongs of the vivisection of pauper children, no progressive mind can doubt that the influence of the Vatican is on the decline." His nickname had stuck to him in honor of a paragraph he was alleged to have written when the American president was wounded by a bullet fired by a lunatic in New Orleans, and which was said to have run, "The president passed a good night and his condition is greatly improved. The assassin is not, however, a German, as was at first supposed." Men stared at that mysterious conjunction till they wanted to go mad, and to shoot somebody themselves. Hibbs, however, was a long, lank man with straight, yellowish hair and a manner that was externally soft and mild, but secretly supercilious. He had been, when at Cambridge, a friend of Leveson, and they had both prided themselves on being moderate politicians. But if you have had your hat smashed over your nose by one who has very recently described himself as a law-abiding man, and if you have had to run for your life with one coat tail, and encouraged to further bodily activity by having irregular pieces of a corrugated iron roof thrown after you by men more energetic than yourself, you will find you emerge with emotions which are not solely those of a moderate politician. Hibbs, however, had already composed a leaderette on the Pebblewick incident, which rather pointed to the truth of the story, so far as his articles ever pointed to anything. His motives for veering vaguely in this direction were, as usual, complex. He knew the millionaire who owned the paper had a hobby of spiritualism, and something might always come out of not suppressing a marvellous story. He knew that two, at least, of the prosperous artisans or small tradesmen who had attested the tale were staunch supporters of the party. He knew that Lord Ivywood must be mildly but not effectually checked, for Lord Ivywood was of the other party, and there could be no milder or less effectual way of checking him than by allowing the paper to lend at least a temporary credit to a well-supported story that came from outside, and certainly had not been, like so many stories, created in the office. Amid all these considerations, had Hibbs, however, steered his way to a more or less confirmatory article, when the sudden apparition of J. Leveson's secretary in the sub-editor's room with a burst collar and broken eyeglasses led Mr. Hibbs into a long private conversation with him and a comparative reversal of his plans. But of course he did not write a new article. He was not of that divine order who make all things new. He chopped and changed his original article in such a way that it was something quite beyond the most bewildering article he had written in the past, and is still prized by those highly cultured persons who collect the worst literature of the world. It began, indeed, with the comparatively familiar formula: whether we take the more lax or the more advanced view of the old disputed problem of the morality or immorality of the wooden signboard as such, we shall all agree that the scenes enacted at Pebblewick were very discreditable to most, though not all, concerned. After that, tact degenerated into a riot of irrelevance. It was a wonderful article. The reader could get from it a faint glimpse of Mr. Hibbs's opinion on almost every other subject except the subject of the article. The first half of the next sentence made it quite clear that Mr. Hibbs, had he been present, would not have lent his active assistance to the massacre of St. Bartholomew or the massacres of September. But the second half of the sentence suggested with equal clearness that, since these two acts were no longer, as it were, in contemplation, and all attempts to prevent them would probably arrive a little late, he felt the warmest friendship for the French nation. He merely insisted that his friendship should never be mentioned except in the French language. It must be called an entente in the language taught to tourists by waiters. It must on no account be called an understanding, in a language understanded of the people. From the first half of the sentence following, it might safely be inferred that Mr. Hibbs had read Milton, or at least the passage about sons of Belial. From the second half, that he knew nothing about bad wine, let alone good. The next sentence began with the corruption of the Roman Empire and contrived to end with Dr. Clifford. Then there was a weak plea for eugenics, and a warm plea against conscription, which was not true eugenics. That was all, and it was headed "The Riot at Pebblewick." Yet some injustice would be done to Hibbs, however, if we concealed the fact that this chaotic leader was followed by quite a considerable mass of public correspondence. The people who write to newspapers are, it may be supposed, a small eccentric body, like most of those that sway a modern state. But at least, unlike the lawyers or the financiers or the members of Parliament or the men of science, they are people of all kinds scattered all over the country, of all classes, counties, ages, sects, sexes, and stages of insanity. The letters that followed Hibbs's article are still worth looking up in the dusty old files of his paper. A dear old lady in the densest part of the Midlands wrote to suggest that there might really have been an old ship wrecked on the shore during the proceedings. Mr. Levison may have omitted to notice it, or at that late hour of the evening it may have been mistaken for a signboard, especially by a person of defective sight. My own sight has been failing for some time, and I am still a diligent reader of your paper. If Mr. Hibbs's diplomacy had left one nerve in his soul undrugged, he would have laughed, or burst into tears, or got drunk, or gone into a monastery over a letter like that. As it was, he measured it with a pencil and decided that it was just too long to get into the column. Then there was a letter from a theorist, and a theorist of the worst sort. There is no great harm in the theorist who makes up a new theory to fit a new event. But the theorist who starts with a false theory and then sees everything as making it come true is the most dangerous enemy of human reason. The letter began like a bullet let loose by the trigger. Is not the whole question met by Exodus 4:3? I enclose pamphlets in which I have proved the point quite plainly, and which none of the bishops or the so-called Free Church ministers have attempted to answer. The connection between the rod or pole and the snake so clearly indicated in Scripture is no less clear in this case. It is well known that those who follow after strong drink often announce themselves as having seen a snake. Is it not clear that those unhappy revellers beheld it in its transformed state as a pole? See also Deuteronomy 18:2. If our so-called religious leaders, etc. The letter went on for 33 pages, and Hibbs was perhaps justified in this case in thinking the letter rather too long. Then there was the scientific correspondent who said, might it not be due to the acoustic qualities of the hall? He had never believed in the corrugated iron hall. The very word hall itself, he added playfully, was often so sharpened and shortened by the abrupt echoes of those repeated metallic curves that it had every appearance of being the word hell, and had caused many theological entanglements and some police prosecutions. In the light of these facts, he wished to draw the editor's attention to some very curious details about this supposed presence or absence of an inn sign. It would be noted that many of the witnesses, and especially the most respectable of them, constantly referred to something that is supposed to be outside. The word outside occurs at least 5 times in the depositions of the complaining persons. Surely, by all scientific analogy, we may infer that the unusual phrase "in sign" is an acoustic error for "inside." The word "inside" would so naturally occur in any discussion either about the building or the individual, when the debate was of a hygienic character. This letter was signed "Medical Student," and the less intelligent parts of it were selected for publication in the paper. Then there was a really humorous man who wrote and said there was nothing at all inexplicable or unusual about the case. He himself, he said, had often seen a signboard outside a pub when he went into it, and been quite unable to see it when he came out. This letter, the only one that had any quality of literature, was sternly set aside by Mr. Hibbs. Then came a cultured gentleman with a light touch, who merely made a suggestion. Had anyone read H.G. Wells' story about the kink in space? He contrived indescribably to suggest that no one had even heard of it except himself, or perhaps of Mr. Wells either. The story indicated that men's feet might be in one part of the world and their eyes in another. He offered the suggestion for what it was worth. The particular pile of letters on which Hibbs, however, threw it, showed only too clearly what it was worth. Then there was a man, of course, who called it all a plot of frenzied foreigners against Britain's shore. But as he did not make it quite clear whether the chief wickedness of these aliens had lain in sticking the sign up or in pulling it down, his remarks, the remainder of which referred exclusively to the conversational misconduct of an Italian ice cream man whose side of the case seemed insufficiently represented, carried the less weight. And then, last but the reverse of least, there plunged in all the people who think they can solve a problem they cannot understand by abolishing everything that has contributed to it. We all know these people. If a barber has cut his customer's throat because the girl has changed her partner for a dance or donkey ride on Hampstead Heath, there are always people to protest against the mere institutions that led up to it. This would not have happened if barbers were abolished, or if cutlery were abolished, or if the objection felt by girls to imperfectly grown beards were abolished, or if the girls were abolished, or if heaths and open spaces were abolished, or if dancing were abolished, or if donkeys were abolished. But donkeys, I fear, will never be abolished. There were plenty of such donkeys in the common land of this particular controversy. Some made it an argument against democracy, because poor George was a carpenter. Some made it an argument against alien immigration, because Misysra Ammon was a Turk. Some proposed that ladies should no longer be admitted to any lectures anywhere, because they had constituted a slight and temporary difficulty at this one, without the faintest fault of their own. Some urged that all holiday resorts should be abolished. Some urged that all holidays should be abolished. Some vaguely denounced the seaside. Some still more vaguely proposed to remove the sea. All said that if this or that, stones or seaweed or strange visitors or bad weather or bathing machines, were swept away with a strong hand, this which had happened would not have happened. They only had one slight weakness, all of them, that they did not seem to have the faintest notion of what had happened. And in this they were not inexcusable. Nobody did know what had happened. Nobody knows it to this day, of course, or it would be unnecessary to write this story. No one can suppose this story is written from any motive save that of telling the plain, humdrum truth. That queer, confused cunning which was the only definable quality possessed by Hibbs, however, had certainly scored a victory so far, for the tone of the weekly papers followed him, with more intelligence and less trepidation, but they followed him. It seemed more and more clear that some kind of light and skeptical explanation was to be given of the whole business, and that the whole business was to be dropped. The story of the signboard and the ethical chapel of corrugated iron was discussed and somewhat disparaged in all the more serious and especially in the religious weeklies, though the Low Church papers seemed to reserve their distaste chiefly for the signboard, and the High Church papers chiefly for the chapel. All agreed that the combination was incongruous, and most treated it as fabulous. The only intellectual organs which seemed to think it might have happened were the spiritualist papers, and their interpretation had not that solidity which would have satisfied Mr. George. It was not until almost a year after that it was felt in philosophical circles that the last word had been said on the matter. An estimate of the incident and of its bearing on natural and supernatural history occurred in Professor Widge's celebrated Historicity of the Petropiscatorial Phenomena, which so profoundly affected modern thought when it came out in parts in the Hibbert Journal. Every one remembers Professor Widge's main contention that the modern critic must apply to the thaumaturgics of the Lake of Tiberias the same principle of criticism which Dr. Bunk and others have so successfully applied to the thaumaturgics of the Cana narrative. Authorities as final as Pink and Toscher, wrote the professor, have now shown with an emphasis that no emancipated mind is entitled to question that the aquavinic thaumaturgy at Cana is wholly inconsistent with the psychology of the master of the feast as modern research has analyzed it, and indeed with the whole Judeo-Aramaic psychology at that stage of its development, as well as being painfully incongruous with the elevated ideals of the ethical teacher in question. But as we rise to higher levels of moral achievement, it will probably be found necessary to apply the Canaic principle to other and later events in the narrative. This principle has, of course, been mainly expounded by Huscher, in the sense that the whole episode is unhistorical, while the alternative theory that the wine was non-alcoholic and was naturally infused into the water can claim on its side the impressive name of Minns. It is clear that if we apply the same alternative to the so-called miraculous draught of fishes, we must either hold with Gilp that the fishes were stuffed representations of fishes artificially placed in the lake, see the Reverend Wise's Christo-Vegetarianism as a world system, where this position is forcibly set forth, or we must, on the Huscherian hypothesis, deprive the piscatorial narrative of all claim to historicity whatever. The difficulty felt by the most daring critics, even Pooke, in adopting this entirely destructive attitude is the alleged improbability of so detailed a narrative being founded on so slight a phrase as the anti-historical critics refer it to. It is urged by Pooke with characteristic relentless reasoning that according to Huscher's theory, a metaphorical but at least noticeable remark, such as "I will make you fishers of men," was expanded into a realistic chronicle of events which contains no mention, even in the passages evidently interpolated, of any men actually found in the nets when they were hauled up out of the sea, or more properly lagoon. It must appear presumptuous or even bad taste for anyone in the modern world to differ on any subject from Pooke. But I would venture to suggest that the very academic splendor and unique standing of the venerable professor, whose 97th birthday was so beautifully celebrated in Chicago last year, may have forbidden him all but intuitive knowledge of how errors arise among the vulgar. I crave pardon for mentioning a modern case known to myself, not indeed by personal presence, but by careful study of all the reports, which presents a curious parallel to such ancient expansions of a text into an incident, in accordance with Husser's law. It occurred at Pebblewick, in the south of England. The town had long been in a state of dangerous religious excitement. The great religious genius who has since so much altered our whole attitude to the religions of the world, Misysra Ammon, had been lecturing on the sands to thousands of enthusiastic hearers. Their meetings were often interrupted, both by children's services run on the most ruthless lines of orthodoxy, and by the League of the Red Rosette, the formidable atheist and anarchist organization. As if this were not enough to swell the whirlpool of fanaticism, the old popular controversy between the Milnian and the complete sublapsarians broke out again on the fated beach. It is natural to conjecture that in the thickening atmosphere of theology in Pebblewick, some controversialist quoted the text, "An evil and adulterous generation seek for a sign, but no sign shall be given it save the sign of the prophet Jonas." A mind like that of Pooke will find it hard to credit, but it seems certain that the effect of this text on the ignorant peasantry of southern England was actually to make them go about looking for a sign, in the sense of those old tavern signs now so happily disappearing. The sign of the prophet Jonas they somehow translated in their stunted minds into a signboard of the ship out of which Jonah was thrown. They went about literally looking for the sign of the ship, and there are some cases of their suffering Smale's hallucination and actually seeing it. The whole incident is a curious parallel to the gospel narrative, and a triumphant vindication of Husser's law. Lord Ivywood paid a public compliment to Professor Widge, saying that he had rolled back from his country what might have been an ocean of superstitions. But, indeed, poor Hibbs had struck the first and stunning blow that scattered the brains of all men. End of chapter 9. Recording by Nicole K.
Pen of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 10. The Character of Quoodle. There lay about in Lord Ivywood's numerous gardens, terraces, outhouses, stable yards, and similar places, a dog that came to be called by the name of Quoodle. Lord Ivywood did not call him Quoodle. Lord Ivywood was almost physically incapable of articulating such sounds. Lord Ivywood did not care for dogs. He cared for the cause of dogs, of course, and he cared still more for his own intellectual self-respect and consistency. He would never have permitted a dog in his house to be physically ill-treated, nor, for that matter, a rat, nor, for that matter, even a man. But if Quoodle was not physically ill-treated, he was at least socially neglected, and Quoodle did not like it. For dogs care for companionship more than for kindness itself. Lord Ivywood would probably have sold the dog, but he consulted experts, as he did on everything he didn't understand, and many things that he did, and the impression he gathered from them was that the dog, technically considered, would fetch very little, mostly, it seemed, because of the mixture of qualities that it possessed. It was a sort of mongrel bull terrier, but with rather too much of the bulldog, and this fact seemed to weaken its price as much as it strengthened its jaw. His lordship also gained a hazy impression that the dog might have been valuable as a watchdog if it had not been able to follow game like a pointer, and that even in the latter walk of life it would always be discredited by an unfortunate talent for swimming as well as a retriever. But Lord Ivywood's impressions may very well have been slightly confused, as he was probably thinking about the Black Stone of Mecca, or some such subject at the moment. The victim of this entanglement of virtues, therefore, still lay about in the sunlight of Ivywood, exhibiting no general result of that entanglement, except the most appalling ugliness. Now, Lady Joan Brett did appreciate dogs. It was the whole of her type and a great deal of her tragedy, that all that was natural in her was still alive under all that was artificial, and she could smell hawthorn or the sea as far off as a dog can smell his dinner. Like most aristocrats, she could carry cynicism almost to the suburbs of the city of Satan. She was quite as irreligious as Lord Ivywood, or rather more. She could be quite equally frigid or supercilious when she felt inclined, and in the great social talent of being tired, she could beat him any day of the week. But the difference remained, in spite of her sophistries and ambitions, that her elemental communications were not cut, and his were. For her the sunrise was still the rising of a sun, and not the turning on of a light by a convenient cosmic servant. For her the spring was really the season in the country, and not merely the season in town. For her, cocks and hens were natural appendages to an English house, and not, as Lord Ivywood had proved to her from an encyclopedia, animals of Indian origin recently imported by Alexander the Great. And so, for her, a dog was a dog, and not one of the higher animals, nor one of the lower animals, nor something that had the sacredness of life, nor something that ought to be muzzled, nor something that ought not to be vivisected. She knew that in every practical sense proper provision would be made for the dog, as indeed provision was made for the yellow dogs in Constantinople by Abdul Hamid, whose life Lord Ivywood was writing for the Progressive Potentate series. Nor was she in the least sentimental about the dog, or anxious to turn him into a pet. It simply came natural to her in passing to rub all his hair the wrong way, and call him something which she instantly forgot. The man who was mowing the garden lawn looked up for a moment, for he had never seen the dog behave in exactly that way before. Quoodle arose, shook himself, and trotted on in front of the lady, leading her up an iron-side staircase, of which, as it happened, she had never made use before. It was then, most probably, that she first took any special notice of him, and her pleasure, like that which she took in the sublime Prophet from Turkey, was of a humorous character. For the complex quadruped had retained the bow legs of the bulldog, and seen from behind reminded her ridiculously of a swaggering little major waddling down to his cub. The dog and the iron stairway between them led her into a series of long rooms, one opening into the other. They formed part of what she had known in earlier days as the disused wing of the Ivywood house, which had been neglected or shut up, probably because it bore some defacements from the fancies of the mad ancestor, the memory of whom the present Lord Ivywood did not think helpful to his own political career. But it seemed to Joan that there were indications of a recent attempt to rehabilitate the place. There was a pail of whitewash in one of the empty rooms, a step-ladder in another, here and there a curtain rod, and at last, in the fourth room, a curtain. It hung all alone on the old woodwork, but it was a very gorgeous curtain, being a kind of orange gold relieved with wavy bars of crimson, which somehow seemed to suggest the very spirit and presence of serpents, though they had neither eyes nor mouths among them. In the next of the endless series of rooms she came upon a kind of ottoman, striped with green and silver, standing alone on the bare floor. She sat down on it from a mixed motive of fatigue and of impudence, for she dimly remembered a story which she had always thought one of the funniest in the world, about a lady only partly initiated in theosophy, who had been in the habit of resting on a similar object, only to discover afterward that it was a Mahatma, covered with his Eastern garment and prostrate and rigid in ecstasy. She had no hopes of sitting on a Mahatma herself, but the very thought of it made her laugh, because it would make Lord Ivywood look such a fool. She was not sure whether she liked or disliked Lord Ivywood, but she felt quite certain that it would gratify her to make him look a fool. The moment she had sat down on the ottoman, the dog, who had been trotting beside her, sat down also, and on the edge of her skirt. After a minute or two she rose, and the dog rose, and she looked yet further down that long perspective of large rooms, in which men like Philip Ivywood forget that they are only men. The next was more ornate, and the next yet more so. It was plain that the scheme of decoration that was in progress had been started at the other end. She could now see that the long lane ended in rooms that from afar off looked like the end of a kaleidoscope, rooms like nests made only from hummingbirds or palaces built of fixed fireworks. Out of this furnace of fragmentary colors she saw Ivywood advancing toward her, with his black suit and his white face accented by the contrast. His lips were moving, for he was talking to himself, as many orators do. He did not seem to see her, and she had to strangle a subconscious and utterly senseless cry, "He is blind!" The next moment he was welcoming her intrusion with the well-bred surprise and rather worldly simplicity suitable to such a case, and Joan fancied she understood why his face had seemed a little bleaker and blinder than usual. It was by contrast. He was carrying clutched to his forefinger, as his ancestors might have carried a falcon clutched to the wrist, a small bright-colored semi-tropical bird, the expression of whose head, neck, and eye was the very opposite of his own. Joan thought she had never seen a living creature with a head so lively and insulting. His provocative eye and pointed crest seemed to be offering to fight 50 gamecocks. It was no wonder, she told herself, that by the side of this gaudy guttersnipe with feathers, Ivywood's faint-colored hair and frigid face looked like the hair and face of a corpse walking. "You'll never know what this is," said Ivywood in his most charming manner. "You've heard of him 100 times and never had a notion of what he was. This is the bulbul." "I never knew," replied Joan. "I'm afraid I never cared. I always thought it was something like a nightingale." Ah, yes, answered Ivywood, but this is the real bulbul, peculiar to the East, Pycnonotus hammerhus. You are thinking of Dahlias goldsey. I suppose I am, replied Lady Joan with a faint smile. It is an obsession. When shall I not be thinking of Dahlias Galsworthy? Was it Galsworthy? Then, feeling quite touched by the soft austerity of her companion's face, she caressed the gaudy and pugnacious bird with one finger and said, It's a dear little thing. The quadruped, intimately called Poodle, did not approve of all this at all. Like most dogs, he liked to be with human beings when they were silent, and he extended a magnificent toleration to them as long as they were talking to each other. But conversational attention paid to any other animal, at all remote from a mongrel bull terrier, wounded Mr. Quoodle in his most sensitive and gentlemanly feelings. He emitted a faint growl. Joan, with all the instincts that were in her, bent down and pulled his hair about once more, and felt the instant necessity of diverting the general admiration from Pycnonotus hammerhus. She turned it to the decoration at the end of the refurnished wing, for they had already come to the last of the long suite of rooms, which ended in some unfinished but exquisite paneling in white and colored woods, inlaid in the Oriental manner. At one corner, the whole corridor ended by curving into a round turret chamber, overlooking the landscape, and which Joan, who had known the house in childhood, was sure was an innovation. On the other hand, a black gap, still left in the lower left-hand corner of the Oriental woodwork, suddenly reminded her of something she had forgotten. Surely, she said, after much mere aesthetic ecstasy, there used to be a staircase there, leading to the old kitchen garden, or the old chapel, or something. Ivywood nodded gravely. Yes, he said, it did lead to the ruins of a medieval chapel, as you say. The truth is, it led to several things that I cannot altogether consider a credit to the family in these days. All that scandal and joking about the unsuccessful tunnel. Your mother may have told you of it. Well, it did us no good in the county, I'm afraid. So as it's a mere scrap of land bordering on the sea, I've fenced it off and let it grow wild. But I'm boarding up the end of the room here for quite another reason. I want you to come and see it. He led her into the round corner turret in which the new architecture ended, and Joan, with her thirst for the beautiful, could not stifle a certain thrill of beatitude at the prospect. 5 open windows of a light and exquisite Saracenic outline looked out over the bronze and copper and purple of the autumn parks and forests to the peacock colors of the sea. There was neither house nor living thing in sight, and familiar as she had been with that coast, she knew she was looking out from a new angle of vision on a new landscape of Ivywood. You can write sonnets, said Ivywood, with something more like emotion in his voice than she had ever heard in it. What comes first into your mind with these open windows? I know what you mean, said Joan after a silence. The same hath oft. Yes, he said, that is how I felt, of perilous seas and fairylands forlorn. There was another silence, and the dog sniffed round and round the circular turret chamber. I want it to be like that, said Ivywood, in a low and singularly moved intonation. I want this to be the end of the house. I want this to be the end of the world. Don't you feel that this is the real beauty of all this Eastern art? That it is colored like the edges of things, like the little clouds of morning and the islands of the blessed. Do you know," and he lowered his voice yet more, "it has the power over me of making me feel as if I were myself, absent and distant, some Oriental traveler who was lost and for whom men were looking. When I see that greenish lemon-yellow enamel there let into the white, I feel that I am standing thousands of leagues from where I stand." "You are right," said Joan, looking at him with some wonder. "I have felt like that myself." "This art," went on Ivywood as in a dream, "does indeed take the wings of the morning and abide in the uttermost parts of the sea. They say it contains no form of life, but surely we can read its alphabet as easily as the red hieroglyphics of sunrise and sunset, which are on the fringes of the robe of God." "I never heard you talk like that before," said the lady, and again stroked the vivid violet feathers of the small eastern bird. Mr. Quoodle could stand it no longer. He had evidently formed a very low opinion of the turret chamber, and of Oriental art generally, but seeing Joan's attention once more transferred to his rival, he trotted out into the longer room, and finding the gap in the woodwork which was soon to be boarded up, but which still opened on to an old dark staircase, he went galumphing down the stairs. Lord Ivywood gently placed the bird on the girl's own finger, and went to one of the open windows, leaning out a little. "Look here," he said, "doesn't this express what we both feel? Isn't this the sort of fairy tale house that ought to hang on the last wall of the world?" And he motioned her to the window-sill, just outside which hung the bird's empty cage, beautifully wrought in brass or some of the yellow metals. "Why, that is the best of all!" cried Lady Joan. "It makes one feel as if it really were the Arabian Nights, as if this were a tower of the gigantic genie with turrets up to the moon, and this were an enchanted prince caged in a golden palace suspended by the evening star." Something stirred in her dim but teeming subconscious, something like a chill or change like that by which we half know that weather has altered, or distant and unnoticed music suddenly ceased. "Where is the dog?" she asked suddenly. Ivywood turned with a mild gray eye. "Was there a dog here?" he asked. "Yes," said Lady Joan Brett, and gave him back the bird, which he restored carefully to its cage. The dog after whom she inquired had, in truth, trundled down a dark, winding staircase, and turned into the daylight, into a part of the garden he had never seen before, nor indeed had anybody else for some time past. It was altogether tangled and overgrown with weeds, and the only trace of human handiwork, the wreck of an old Gothic chapel, stood waist-high in numberless nettles and soiled with crawling fungoids. Most of these merely discolored the gray, crumbling stone with shades of bronze or brown, but some of them, particularly on the side farthest from the house, were of orange or purple tints, almost bright enough for Lord Ivywood's Oriental decoration. Some fanciful eyes that fell on the place afterward found something like an allegory in those graven and broken saints or archangels, feeding such fiery and ephemeral parasites as those toadstools, like blood or gold. But Mr. Quoodle had never set himself up as an allegorist, and he merely trotted deeper and deeper into the gray-green English jungle. He grumbled very much at the thistles and nettles, almost as a city man will grumble at the jostling of a crowd. But he continued to press forward, with his nose near the ground, as if he had already smelt something that interested him. And indeed he had smelt something in which a dog, except on special occasions, is much more interested than he is in dogs. Breaking through a last barrier of high and hoary purple thistles, he came out on a semicircle of somewhat clearer ground, dotted with slender trees, and having by way of back scene the brown brick arch of an old tunnel. The tunnel was boarded up with a very irregular fence or mask, made of motley wooden laths, and looked somehow rather like a pantomime cottage. In front of this, a sturdy man in very shabby shooting clothes was standing attending to a battered old frying pan, which he held over a rather irregular flame, which, small as it was, smelt strongly of burnt rum. In the frying pan, and also on the top of a cask or barrel that served for a table hard by, were a number of the gray, brown, and even orange fungi which were plastered over the stone angels and dragons of the fallen chapel. "Hello, old man," said the person in the shooting jacket with tranquillity, and without looking up from his cooking. "Come to pay us a visit? Come along, then." He flashed one glance at the dog and returned to the frying pan. "If your tail were 2 inches shorter, you'd be worth £100. Had any breakfast?" The dog trotted across to him and began nosing and sniffing around his dilapidated leather gaiters. The man did not interrupt his cookery, on which his eyes were fixed and both his hands were busy, but he crooked his knee and foot so as to caress the quadruped in a nerve under the angle of the jaw, the stimulation of which, as some men of science have held, is for a dog what a good cigar is for a man. At the same moment, a huge voice like an ogre's came from within the masked tunnel, calling out, "And who are ye talking to?" A very crooked kind of window in the upper part of the pantomime cottage burst open, and an enormous head, with erect, startling, and almost scarlet hair, and blue eyes as big as a bullfrog's, was thrust out above the scene. "Hump!" cried the ogre. "Me moral counsels have been thrown away. In the last week I've sung you 14½ songs of me own composition, instead of which you go about stealing dogs. You're following in the path of Parson What's-his-name in every way, I'm afraid." "No," said the man with the frying pan impartially. "Parson Whitelady struck a very good path for doubling on Pebblewick. That I was glad to follow. But I think he was quite silly to steal dogs. He was young and brought up pious. I know too much about dogs to steal one." "Well," asked the large red-haired man, "and how do you get a dog like that?" "I let him steal me," said the person stirring the pan. And indeed the dog was sitting erect and even arrogant at his feet, as if he was a watchdog at a high salary, and had been there before the building of the tunnel. End of chapter 10. Recording by Bill Mosley, Frellsburg, Texas, USA.